The silk tie strangles my neck as I shove the attacker into the vestry. My best man warned me about the girl outside, but this? A former student lunges from the pews, and now I'm dragging him past the lilies, seconds before Catherine walks down the aisle. His pocket burns in my hand, a photo of me with Chloe, but the provost's daughter is circled in red. This isn't just revenge. It's a hit on everything. The silk lining of Julian Sterling's tuxedo jacket clung to his damp shoulder blades, a cold, slick reminder of the heat rising beneath his skin. He stood behind the heavy oak doors of the vestry at St. Jude's, the air thick with the scent of beeswax, old hymnals, and the metallic tang of his own nervous sweat. His thumb hovered over the glass of his phone, the screen's glow casting a clinical light on his face. With a series of rapid, practiced taps, he navigated to the sent folder. He watched as the progress bar flickered, a line of blue light eating away at the evidence of his life's work. Or rather, the work he had claimed as his own. One by one, the incriminating emails vanished. Conversations with offshore shell companies, draft papers with Chloe Miller's original data, and the frantic threats he'd sent to keep the truth buried. He hit the empty trash icon. The screen went black, reflecting his tight-lipped expression and the perfect knot of his silver tie. He checked his collar. Number 47. The sequence was intact. As long as the sequence held, the world stayed in its orbit. A floorboard creaked behind him. The sound was sharp, like a dry branch snapping in winter. Julian didn't turn immediately. He composed his features, smoothing the mask of the visionary academic back into place. Elias, the former head of security who had transitioned into a professional nuisance, stepped from the shadows of the stone archway. He smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap peppermint, a scent that felt like a stain on the sacred atmosphere of the church. Julian reached into his inner pocket. His fingers brushed the crisp, sharp edges of an envelope. It was thick, heavy with the weight of $100 bills, the physical manifestation of silence. He thrust the cash into Elias's calloused palm, the paper crinkling with a sound that seemed loud enough to echo in the rafters. "Keep your mouth shut until the honeymoon is over," Julian whispered, his voice a low hiss that barely carried past the man's ears. Elias fanned the bills, his eyes darting toward the stained glass windows, where a weeping saint watched them in shades of deep, bloody crimson. "This buys silence for the emails, Mr. Sterling," the old man muttered, his voice gravelly. "It doesn't cover the police report I filed an hour ago." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The police? He felt a surge of icy adrenaline. He had been smart. He had set up an anonymous tip line months ago, a transparency initiative for the university board. It was a masterstroke of optics, a way to look beyond reproach while secretly monitoring any whispers of his own fraud. He had funneled all internal complaints through that system, believing he held the only key to the vault. He took a step back, his hand instinctively going to his neck to check the tag on his shirt. "We had an agreement, Elias. That money is more than you'd make in 3 years of guarding empty hallways." "The agreement changed when I saw what was in those files," Elias said, a jagged smile twisting his face. He shoved the envelope into his waistband. Julian felt a sudden, sickening shift in his gut. He had used his transparency system to log this very transaction, intending to frame it as a security expense if it ever came to light. But as he looked at Elias's confident smirk, a cold prickle danced across his skin. The system. He had designed it to be foolproof, but he had forgotten that a door designed to let him look out also let others look in. The truth hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The anonymous tip line wasn't a vault. It was a broadcast. Every email he had deleted, every bribe he had logged as a consultation fee, and the very GPS coordinates of this meeting were being piped directly to the university's legal counsel and the Vanderbilt family's private investigators. He hadn't been cleaning his trail. He had been illuminating it with a neon sign. His legs felt like lead. The very tool he had built to protect his ascent was the anchor dragging him into the depths. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and the organist struck a triumphant chord. The vibration rattled Julian's teeth, a deep, resonant hum that felt like a judge's gavel striking over and over. White lilies lined the aisle, their cloying, sweet perfume suddenly suffocating, smelling more like a funeral than a wedding. Julian stepped out of the vestry and into the chapel foyer, the transition from shadow to light making him squint. He needed to move. He needed to fix this. The university provost, Arthur Thompson, stood near a marble pillar, looking every bit the elder statesman of academia in his three-piece suit. Arthur was a man who valued prestige above all else, a man Julian had been grooming for months. "Arthur," Julian said, forcing a smile that felt brittle, like thin ice over a dark lake. He moved into the provost's space, leaning in to create that false sense of intimacy he had spent years perfecting. "I was hoping we could steal a moment before the madness begins. I've been reviewing the structural integrity of the new department's budget. I think we can find the room for that deanship we discussed." Arthur adjusted his gold signet ring, his eyes scanning Julian's face with a clinical detachment. "The board is looking for stability, Julian. They want a man whose reputation is as white as that shirt of yours." "One would imagine," Julian echoed, his voice metered and surgical, "that my track record speaks for itself. The Vanderbilt name joined with my research. It's a cornerstone for the university's next decade." "Research is a fickle thing," Arthur hummed. It was that low, vibrating dirge he made when he was dealing with unpleasantries. It sounded like a distant hornet's nest. "It requires a certain purity of origin." Before Julian could pivot, a hand gripped his elbow. It was James Wilson, his best man. James's face was flushed, his eyes darting toward the heavy doors leading to the courtyard. "Julian, we've got a situation, James's voice was a frantic whisper, his validation loop tick kicking into high gear. "There's a woman out there, hooded, pacing by the sundial. She looks like she's about to explode, Julian felt a surge of irritation. "Handle it, James. That's why you're standing here." "I tried, But she's counting, Julian. She's standing on the steps, counting them under her breath. It's creepy. People are starting to stare." "The stare count." The phrase hit Julian like a splash of ice water. "Chloe." He looked past James, through the arched windows that looked out onto the courtyard. The dry leaves on the pavement skittered in a constant, rhythmic scratching sound, like fingernails on stone. In the center of the yard, near the iron sundial, a figure stood wrapped in a dark coat. "I'll deal with it," Julian snapped, his voice losing its academic polish. He turned back to Arthur, but the provost was already moving toward the front pews, his low hum fading into the sound of the gathering crowd. Julian stepped toward the side exit, his mind racing. He had to neutralize Chloe before she reached the sanctuary. The courtyard was a trap of open space, the belfries looming overhead like watchful eyes. As he stepped out, the chill of the afternoon bit into his skin. He saw her then, a small, huddled shape at the edge of the stone path. But as he moved toward her, a shadow detached itself from the side of the building. It wasn't Chloe. It was a young man, a student Julian recognized from his senior seminar. Thomas Bradley. Thomas looked disheveled, his cheap suit smelling of stale coffee and desperation. He didn't speak. He lunged. The attack was sudden and clumsy. Thomas tackled Julian, the force of the blow knocking the wind from his lungs. They crashed into a stand of lilies near the side entrance, the white petals scattering like snow. Julian felt the damp earth against his back and the sharp sting of a thorn catching his cheek. "You thief!" Thomas hissed, his hands fumbling for Julian's throat. "You ruined her. You took everything." Julian's survival instinct, honed by years of social climbing and backroom deals, kicked in. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a man who knew how to leverage weight. He twisted, driving his elbow into Thomas's ribs. The boy gasped, his grip loosening. Julian scrambled up, his fingers curling into a fist. He swung, a short, ugly punch that caught Thomas in the jaw. The boy slumped, his head hitting the stone base of a planter with a sickening thud. Julian stood over him, chest heaving, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder. He looked around frantically. The courtyard was empty, the guests already seated inside, the skittering of the leaves as the only witness to the violence. He grabbed Thomas by the collar of his cheap suit, avoiding the skin, thinking of the contamination Thomas so feared, and dragged him toward the vestry door. The boy was dead weight, his heels dragging across the pavement with a rhythmic scraping. Julian shoved him into the small, windowless stone room, the scent of unwashed wool and ancient sweat rising to meet him. Thomas groaned, stirring in the dim light. Julian didn't wait for him to recover. He pinned the boy against the heavy oak wardrobe, his hands shaking. "Who sent you? Was it Chloe? Did she tell you to do this?" Thomas spat, a glob of red landing on Julian's pristine white shirt. Julian recoiled, his heart stopping. "The shirt, number 47. It was ruined." "Look in your pocket, Professor." Thomas croaked, a jagged smile spreading across his face. Julian reached into the boy's jacket, his fingers trembling. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was a photograph. In the flickering light of the vestry, the image was clear. It was Julian, years ago, sitting in a dimly lit library with Chloe Miller. They were leaning over a manuscript, their heads close together. But it wasn't the intimacy that froze Julian's blood. It was the red ink. A circle had been drawn around the face of a woman in the background of the photo. A woman Julian hadn't noticed that day. It was the provost's daughter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a jilted lover's revenge. This was a coordinated hit. Someone had been watching him for years, documenting every slip, every shadow. The circle around the provost's daughter meant they knew about the bribe he'd offered her to secure his initial tenure, a secret he thought had died with the girl's accident 3 years ago. The vestry felt like a vertical tomb, the walls closing in. He looked at Thomas, who was laughing now, a wet, wheezing sound. Julian realized he hadn't just caught an attacker. He had walked right into the center of a web that was now tightening around his throat. He backed out of the vestry, locking the door from the outside. His mind was a blur of static and fear. He had to get to the altar. He had to marry Catherine. The Vanderbilt name was the only shield left. If he could just get through the next hour, he could use their lawyers, their influence, their money to make this go away. He sprinted toward the side entrance of the sanctuary, ignoring the tear in his jacket and the red stain on his chest. He burst through the doors just as the wedding march began. But the music was wrong. Instead of the triumphant swell of the organ, a distorted, tinny sound filled the vaulted ceiling. It was a recording. Julian froze at the edge of the red carpet. The voice echoing through the church was his own, his lecture on the ethical architecture of the soul. Integrity. His recorded voice boomed, the sound bouncing off the heavy timber beams. Is the only currency that does not devalue. Without it, a man is merely a ghost in a suit. The guests began to murmur, a low rising tide of confusion and judgment. Julian looked toward the back of the church. The heavy oak doors swung open, framing a figure in the brilliant afternoon light. It was Chloe Miller. She wasn't wearing the disheveled clothes of a graduate student. She was draped in ivory silk, a Vera Wang gown that was a mirror image of the one Catherine Vanderbilt was supposed to be wearing. She began to walk down the aisle, her movements slow and deliberate. 1, 2, 3. Her voice carried in the silent intervals of the recording. She was counting the steps. Julian felt the world tilt. The guests were standing now, their faces a sea of pastel silk and horrified stares. He looked toward the front row. Arthur Thompson, the provost, had stood up, his face a mask of academic outrage. His academic hum had turned into a low, vibrating growl. Chloe reached the chancel rail. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly at Julian. Her eyes, usually downcast, were fixed on his with a terrifying clarity. The research was never yours, Julian, she said, her voice a whisper that somehow cut through the distorted recording of his lecture. You didn't carve the masterpiece. You just stole the marble. The air in the church grew cold, a sudden draft extinguishing the altar candles. The flames didn't flicker. They simply went out, leaving behind the bitter, smoky smell of extinguished wax. From the side of the altar, a shadow moved. William Vanderbilt, Catherine's brother, stepped forward. He was a man of immense physical power, his broad shoulders filling his tuxedo. He was tapping his knuckles against the wooden rail, thud, 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 thud. The pattern of 4, the metronome of impending violence. You've got a lot of nerve, Sterling, William said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Julian's teeth. William, wait. Julian started, backing away toward the baptismal font. This is a misunderstanding. Chloe she's unwell. She's been obsessed with my work for years. Your work? William laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. My sister's been doing some reading, Julian. She's been reading the files you thought you deleted. William lunged. He didn't use the refined movements of a socialite. He moved with the gridiron rage of a man who had lost everything on a football field and had nothing left to protect but his family's name. He tackled Julian, the two of them crashing into the baptismal font. The heavy stone base groaned under their weight. A massive spray of ice-cold holy water erupted, soaking Julian's ruined tuxedo. The water felt like needles against his skin, radiating a chill that seemed to lower the room's temperature by 10 degrees. Julian scrambled to his feet, his breath misting in the cold air. He was a cornered animal now, the royal we of his persona stripped away. He crawled toward the pulpit, his hands slipping on the wet marble floor. Behind him, he could hear the chaos, the screams of the guests, the frantic, of James Wilson, and the steady, heavy gait of William Vanderbilt coming for him again. He reached the pulpit and pulled himself up, using the wood grain, twisted into the pattern of a screaming face, to steady himself. He looked down at the congregation. They weren't guests anymore. They were a jury. Chloe was moving again. She walked toward the front pew where Julian's mother, Margaret, sat clutching her purse. Margaret was making that rhythmic, paper-tearing noise as she folded and refolded her husband's arrest warrant. Chloe reached into a basket she had been carrying and pulled out a bouquet. It wasn't lilies or roses. It was a cluster of dead, blackened stalks, their petals brittle and gray. She handed them to Margaret. "A gift for the mother of the architect," Chloe said. The flowers were wrapped in a single sheet of paper. Julian recognized the handwriting instantly. It was a page from his secret, unpublished manuscript, the one he had written in the dead of night, the one that contained the core of his genius. But the margins were filled with Chloe's unique research notes, her symbols, her soul. Margaret took the bouquet, her face turning a ghostly pale. She looked up at Julian, then back at the paper. The crinkling of the warrant stopped. "Oh, Julian," she whispered, her voice carrying through the silent sanctuary. "What have you done?" Julian gripped the edge of the pulpit. He had to regain control. He had to use the one weapon he had left, his voice. He looked at the security guard standing at the back of the room. "Security!" he shouted, his voice cracking but still carrying that metered, surgical precision. "Remove this woman. She is a stalker. She is suffering from a total break with reality. Look at her. She's wearing a wedding dress to a ceremony she wasn't invited to. She's dangerous." He believed it as he said it. It was the logical move. In the high society world of the Vanderbilts, a hysterical woman was a problem to be managed, not a witness to be heard. He saw the guards nod and begin to move down the side aisles. Hope, a small, flickering flame, sparked in his chest. If they took her out now, he could claim the recording was a prank, the dress a stunt. He could spin this. He was the architect of his own reality. The guards reached Chloe. One of them, a man in a gray suit, reached for her arm. Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on Julian. "1, 2, 3, she whispered. Julian felt a surge of relief. "See? She's incoherent. Get her out of here." The guards stepped in, their hands closing on Chloe's silk sleeves. Julian began to adjust his tie, his mind already calculating the apology he would give to the provost. He would blame the security breach on Elias. He would... A shadow fell across the aisle. A man stepped out from the narthex, his presence stopping the guards in their tracks. He was older, with gray hair and a thick mustache, wearing a police uniform that was pressed to a razor edge. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, looking at the empty space to his left as if someone were walking beside him. "We aren't going anywhere," the man said. It was Robert Miller, Chloe's father. Julian's heart plummeted. Robert wasn't just a cop. He was the man Julian had paid off 3 years ago to keep the story of the provost's daughter quiet. He had used the money for his wife's medical bills, a transaction Julian thought had bound them together in a permanent, silent pact. Robert walked past the guards, who stepped back, recognizing the authority of the badge and the man. He reached the chancel rail and looked up at Julian. "Officer Miller," Julian said, his voice trembling. "This is a private event. You have no jurisdiction here." "We have all the jurisdiction we need, Julian," Robert said, his voice thick with a decade of suppressed rage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. Not a warrant, but bank statements. "We want to know about these. Monthly wire transfers from a shell company called Symmetry Holdings, sent to an account held by a man who sold his daughter's justice for a hospital bed." Robert slammed the papers onto the rail. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent church. "I didn't send those," Julian lied, his voice a pathetic squeak. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The paper trail says otherwise," Robert said. "And my daughter, she's got the rest." Julian lunged over the pulpit, his fingers clawing for the bank statements. He had to destroy them. If he could just get the paper, if he could just... Robert was faster. He shoved Julian back, a powerful two-handed strike to the chest. Julian stumbled, his heels catching on the velvet cushions of the chancel rail. He fell backward, his spine slamming against the heavy gold ceremonial cross. The cross groaned, tilting precariously. The congregation gasped as the massive icon swayed over the front pews where the Vanderbilt family sat. William Vanderbilt reached up, his massive hands catching the gold bar and steadying it with a grunt of effort. Julian lay on the floor, gasping for air, the cold marble biting into his skin. He looked up to see a pair of white silk shoes standing over him. Catherine Vanderbilt. She hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She stood there, her hair pulled back so tightly, her features looked frozen in a mask of cold fury. She was holding her bridal bouquet, a lush arrangement of white roses and ivy. She reached into the center of the flowers. Her hand didn't emerge with a ring or a handkerchief. She pulled out a small, black digital recorder. "The debt is due, Julian," she said, her voice like a razor. She clicked the play button. The speakers didn't produce the distorted lecture this time. The sound was crystal clear. It was a recording from the vestry, only minutes old. Julian's own voice, cold and predatory, echoed through the sanctuary. "Keep your mouth shut until the honeymoon is over. This buys silence for the emails. We had an agreement." The confession played in a loop, the words silence and agreement bouncing off the weeping saint in the stained glass window. Julian looked from Catherine to Chloe. They were standing side by side now, the two ivory dresses creating a wall of white that blocked his path. He saw the knowing look they exchanged, the subtle nod of a plan perfectly executed. The identical dress wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a stunt. It was a psychological scalpel designed to unnerve him, to make him look at Chloe and see the life he had stolen, and to look at Catherine and see the life he would never have. You work together?" Julian whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I don't like being a prop, Julian," Catherine said, pulling out her leather-bound notebook and a red pen. She made a slow, heavy X across the page. "And I don't like being cheated. Chloe provided the evidence. I provided the stage." Arthur Thompson stood up in the front row. He wasn't humming anymore. He looked at Julian with a disgust so profound it seemed to age him 10 years. "Mr. Sterling," the provost said, his voice echoing with the authority of the institution, "the University of Vanderbilt Foundation has no place for a thief. Your tenure is revoked. Your doctoral status is under review. And as of this moment, your employment is terminated." The guests were no longer silent. They were filming. Hundreds of phones were held aloft, their small, glowing screens capturing Julian's collapse. He was a viral execution, a high society drowning in a sea of digital light. Julian looked toward the back of the church. He saw two men in gray suits standing by the heavy oak doors. They weren't university security. They were lean, clinical-looking men with the unmistakable air of federal agents. "Internal Revenue Service," one of them said, his voice carrying through the chaos. "Mr. Sterling, we'd like to have a word about Symmetry Holdings and those offshore accounts." Julian scrambled to his feet, his mind a frantic, broken machine. He tried to speak, to weave one more lie, to find the royal we that had protected him for so long. "One must understand," he began, his voice cracking, "the structural integrity of the situation." His voice failed him. It wasn't a pivot, it was a collapse. The silver-tongued confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged fear. He looked at his reflection in the silver collection plate on the altar. He didn't see the visionary academic. He saw a hollow man in a ruined suit, a parasite who had finally run out of hosts. He didn't wait for the agents. He turned and bolted toward the side garden door. He burst out into the chaotic tangle of thorns and ivy. The wind was whipping the vines in opposing directions, the shifting green patterns making him dizzy. He tore off his tuxedo jacket, the silk lining now a rag, and threw it into the dirt. He paused by the stone fountain in the center of the garden. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky with impossible clarity. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had spent 20 years building a house of cards, numbering his shirts and rotating his lies to ensure the sequence was never broken. He had sacrificed Chloe's brilliance, Robert's integrity, and his own soul to join a world that had never wanted him in the first place. He heard the sound of car doors slamming in the distance. He peered through the hedges. Catherine and Chloe were walking toward a waiting black car. They weren't looking back. They were talking, their heads close together, a new partnership built on the wreckage of his life. Julian watched them go. He realized then that he hadn't been the architect. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played. The two women he had tried to exploit had used his own hubris to reclaim their names and destroy his. He walked back into the church, the sanctuary now empty and silent. The guests were gone, the lilies were trampled, and the scent of extinguished wax hung heavy in the air. He stood before the altar, his eyes drawn to the silver collection plate. He leaned over it, staring at the distorted reflection of his face. The polished metal twisted his features, making him look like the screaming face in the wood of the pulpit. He reached up and touched his collar. He felt the small, inked number, 47. He pulled the shirt open, the buttons popping and skittering across the marble floor like teeth. He looked at the tag. The ink was fading, the number blurring into a gray smudge. The sequence was broken. The facade was gone. Julian Sterling sat down on the cold stone steps of the altar, the silence of St. Jude's wrapping around him like a shroud. He was alone in a hollow sanctuary, a man who had traded everything for a reflection and ended up with nothing but the dark.